Welcome back to the latest episode of The Super's Kid. From Harlem to homicide to Hollywood. My name is Randy Jurgensen.
In this episode, we will now be entering the decade of the 70s. Probably one of the, on all levels, all fronts, the worst decade, especially not for me personally, but to be a homicide detective. 1971 ended with me going to a trial and convicted two soldiers from a Brooklyn family for the killing of a police officer. They were spared the electric chair because the federal government struck it down as being unconstitutional. There was firmly planted $50,000 on my head. I was now looking constantly over my shoulder. I was living basically as a detective, a homicide detective, working entirely different, knowing that price was on my head. It also, on the Hollywood part of the episode, The Super's Kid, The French Connection was released in October of '71 to rave reviews and would be nominated for seven Academy Awards. I also now was a second grade detective, strictly working on homicide. And in May of '71, police officers Piagentini and police officer Jones were gunned down, and the Black Liberation Army took credit for that. By late 1971, I was working on the Hollywood end of it, working on a motion picture called The Godfather. I would then go on to work on pictures called Badge 373. I would then work on the 7-Ups. I would work on the report to the commissioner. And basically what these pictures were doing, they were reflecting the condition of, in New York City, crime, specifically crime and drugs. So by the time I got to 1972, as I say, I was a homicide detective. But the condition of the city was the following. First of all, from the top down, we were losing a president, President Nixon, who would come out of office, and the president that would take over, Ford, allegedly, when the city was asking for federal funding, allegedly, but headlines in a New York City paper, that the president, the government, the federal government told the city of New York to drop dead. According to Felix Rohatyn, who was the comptroller of the, in the city of New York, we would come as close as 4 hours to be bankrupt. So, what was going on specifically in the city of New York? Well, we were entering into a decade where an average of 2,000 homicides a year, which was turning out to be the norm. This was the norm. The graffiti was totally out of control. Most of it appearing, on the subways. Speaking of that, they were not safe to ride in. Absolutely not. In fact, there was a man, I won't call his name, carried a gun, claimed he was getting mugged. He probably was. And he shot the people that were doing the mugging. So out on the streets, there was no gun control. There was no gun control. I mean, in the city of New York, to kill 2,000 people a year, there had to be shootings and killings. And remember, I'm only talking of killings, not the shootings. It had to happen every day. It had to happen every day. The city had become virtually broke, unsafe, dangerous. At one point, it had been called, Fun City, and what it was turning into was Fear City, and this was being reflected in the motion pictures that were being made. As far as tourism, when the people were coming from the airports into the city, whether they were coming from Indiana, California, wherever they were coming from. And remember, New York City, make no two ways about it. I mean, it is virtually a capital city in almost every department within the United States, whether it's fashion, whether it's Wall Street, whether it's the theater, whether it's the museums. I mean, people would come from Europe just for those things in New York City. Now, those people were being given pamphlets of how to protect themselves walking in the city of New York. Always carry money. And as soon as you were accosted, give the perp the money. Now, who was the perp? Well, if you had drug addicts, people that were using heroin, it wasn't free. It was far from free. And so to buy heroin, you couldn't even barter for it. To buy heroin, you had to have money. You had to have money. And so you get your money by taking it out on the public. The Bronx, in particular, was virtually on fire. The buildings were being torched. Fire engines responding to the fires were being sniper shot at. It was so bad. At one point, seriously, they were thinking of moving Yankee Stadium down to the west side of the yards, they called it, the west side of Manhattan. They would also make a motion picture about that. I believe it was called Bonfires of the whatever. So all of what was going on was being reflected in books that were being written, pamphlets that were being given out, and movies that were being made. At one point, books like this were being made. And of course, it is, Welcome to Fear City, but it's shown or revealed through motion pictures. On the cover here, it happens to be The French Connection, but there are many other pictures within this book that's showing how dangerous it was to be in New York City. I mean, you had Charles Bronson that was making vigilante type of movies. However, to get back to it, one of the answers from the police department, believe it or not, with the 2,000 homicides a year and the city going broke, well, for 2 weeks, the sanitation department worked without pay, and of course, they stopped. The garbage was 6 feet high, no exaggeration. The rat infestation, if I'm saying that word right, was out of control. I worked in a precinct, the 2-8, which was in Harlem, and they would get a call when the children were coming home from school. Would the police come down and escort the children or shoot the rats that were in the apartment so the children could get off the bus, come into the apartment, go in? That's not an exaggeration. The police department, through no fault of its own, because we ran out of funds, the answer to the 2,000 homicides or the graffiti or the crime or the homelessness or the squeegee situation or how dangerous the streets were, the city of New York laid off 5,000 cops. No money to pay them, no money. That was it. They laid them off. That was the answer. That's how basically I personally was greeted in 1972. Now, Foster and Laurie lost their lives in May of 1971. By now, coming into 1972, and a year of chasing these cop killers, we had secured 5 to 6 witnesses on that case, and they were being held in safe houses, and it was a secret to everybody. We needed them. We needed them. They would prove to be so great at the trial. However, we had not caught the killers yet, but we were out chasing them. I would find myself going to Atlanta. I would find myself going to St. Louis after a shootout. I would wind up out in San Francisco with 2 cop killers. I will get into that, a little later on. So, January of 1972, again, I was a homicide detective, basically chasing cop killers. In January 27th of 1972, 2 more police officers who wore that magnificent blue uniform were set up and executed. They were Greg Foster, a sergeant, survived Vietnam, decorated in Vietnam, came home to wear that blue uniform, cost him his life. Rocco Laurie, as I say, this is 50 years ago. It's still difficult. Rocco Laurie survived Vietnam, a Bronze Star holder, came home, wore that magnificent blue uniform, and was executed. And that was January 27, 1972. I'm still speaking to you here in 2021, but next month, January 27th of 2022, will be 50 years ago that they lost their life. Who did it? Black Liberation Army. Again, on that night I was working, and it was night, and we got the call, and I jumped in my car, and I went down to the scene of where they were executed. I was not going to go to the hospital as I did with Piagentini and Jones and go through that again. I couldn't. I could not. I could not meet the family, wait for the I couldn't do that. However, on that night, when I went down there, we were looking for the car that they got away in. I don't know how that information came about, but I met a sergeant down there who sort of was in charge at the scene and was dispensing, if you will, the various detectives and police officers. You go here to look for the car, you go over here. He was going to go over here to different locations, and that's exactly what we were doing. That sergeant was Ray Kelly, who would later on become a police commissioner in the city of New York. And yes, it was Ray Kelly's team that found the car. I then went over to the precinct. I reported in. I signed into the precinct, said what I did, and I then left and went back up to Harlem, to continue doing what I was doing. However, that job would be expanded now that we lost two more New York City police officers. 1972 started out that way. By the time we got to April of 1972, the French Connection on April, I believe it was the 12th of April, the French Connection won 5 of the Academy Awards out of the 7 that they were nominated. Now, when we were kids, we would play stickball, and the sewer in the middle of the street, that was home plate. The sewer down the block, that would be second base. The sewer going into the next block, anything over that sewer, if you hit it over there, was considered a home run. Phil D'Antoni, the producer of Bullet, the producer of the French Connection, won the Academy Award for the French Connection. He sent a telegram, and the telegram said, Randy, Sonny, meaning Sonny Grasso, the French Connection has hit 3 sewers. And I know what he meant by that. It was a home run. I treasure that telegram. By April, The Godfather would come out in March, I believe, of 1972. And so this March of 2022, The Godfather is going to be 50 years old. As I say, I was continuing to work on the movies. I was continuing to chase cop killers. And April the 12th, The French Connection won those Academy Awards. On April the 14th of 1972, which this coming April of 2022, this case that I'm talking about is going to be 50 years of age. Police officer Philip Cardillo responded on what would turn out to be a phony call to Minister Louis Farrakhan's Mosque number 7 in Harlem, where he would be shot and he would he would pass away 5 days later in a hospital that had a reputation of having never lost a cop. That case I would not get for a year, as 1973 I continued making movies. I continued chasing cop killers across the country, and that case would evolve into many articles. A book that would be written about it was Murder at the Harlem Mosque, written by John Devaney and Sonny Grasso. Eventually, it would turn into a book written by me called The Circle of Six. And that case would cost me my police career. I will get into all of that on our next episode. So stay tuned. Please take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next episode. God bless.